One of the first things I wrote in machine code was an expanding Starfield, just literally flying through. I found it mesmerizing.
That was the moment that David Braben, co-creator of Elite and founder of Frontier Developments, changed space games forever. It was video games' equivalent of the Big Bang, the birth of an idea that would eventually go on to shape 4 decades worth of space games, and, eventually, Starfield. In the early 1980s, space games were pretty rudimentary, and there was little more to them than flying a ship and shooting aliens. David Braben, who at the time was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, had the idea that a game set in space could be so much more.
We had Space Invaders, had Galaxian, we had Williams Defender, but they all had a very similar format, i.e. 3 lives. Score that goes up, you get a new life at 10,000, another, you get a smart bomb or something game specific at 1,500. Pac-Man was there. And I know it sounds silly, but even then they were starting to become a little bit samey. I had played some games like Adventure, Colossal Quest, text-based adventures, the sort where you say go north, pick up key. It struck me that these are being played on the same machine. Surely you can have a more interesting combination where you care. I found with Space Invaders, all I really cared about was whether I got slightly further than I did last time.
It was around this time, frustrated with the state of sci-fi arcade games and tinkering with some home games, that Braben met fellow programmer Ian Bell, and together shared notes on some projects that they were working on.
We talked about it and we thought, wait a second, if you had a real spaceship, you'd probably be doing something. You'd be traveling between destinations, making money. It's that sort of light bulb moment where you start thinking, wait a second, isn't score just money? It sounds sort of terribly sort of capitalist, but from a gameplay design point of view, it was fantastic.
It makes sense. The points you score for destroying a ship in Galaxian can be equated to the bounty you claim for shooting a pirate in Elite. But the latter, you also have the added benefit of going through the wreckage and selling on what's left for additional cash. By rethinking the elements that made up much of the arcade games of the day, in simulation terms, Braben and Bell came up with the idea of Elite, a game where the goal wasn't to shoot down tiny aliens for power-ups, but to travel the galaxy, fight pirates, collect rewards, upgrade your ship, and continue into the vastness beyond. However, Braben didn't just want to travel one galaxy, he wanted to fly across 8. And he wanted them to be filled with planets, 256 each to be precise. But back in 1984, he was working with a computer that had less memory than a modern day calculator.
We were targeting the 32K BBC Micro, but actually only really had 20K of available memory because the screen uses up some, the operating system uses up some. And I thought, well, how many locations can you travel between? And I was thinking, 20, 30. And even then you think, well, that's not very much data on each one, because I've got to have all the 3D render, which I'd already written. We knew how big that was. You're going to need all the gameplay. You're going to need, there was going to need the ship models. So, how many ship models can we afford to have in the memory? It became one of those sort of cruel things, thinking, well, I want lots of those, but I also want lots of those.
The solution was a technique that studios like Bethesda and Hello Games and countless others have used since to create their own star systems: procedural generation. It's a tool that's used a lot in modern day video games, but back in the 1980s it was a relatively new idea.
And I thought, wait a second, I'll write a program to generate it. And it generated so quickly, I thought, well, we can just generate it every time, we don't need to store it.
By procedurally generating galaxies, Braben and Bell were able to save a tremendous amount of space without cutting back on their ambitions. However, it wasn't always quite as simple as they first thought. In 2013, Braben hosted a TED Talk called Rules Can Be Beautiful, which detailed the idea of saving space by procedurally generating new planets each time you want to explore a galaxy.
Essentially what it's doing is you are constraining rules to make things that make sense, making sure that the names of the places were pronounceable, making sure the economies were the right sort of ratios, and then applying a sort of human logic to generating lots of galaxies and actually just looking if it's right. It's amazing how something that is genuinely random can appear quite lopsided, but it comes naturally out of the random nature.
As such, some galaxies were not quite as intended, with one planet randomly even given the name Arse. But ultimately, the system was a game changer, not just for Elite, but for space games that followed in its footsteps. It allowed them to do things that they would have never been able to do before.
But it's the joy of being able to add something which we couldn't otherwise add.
With Elite in hand, Braben and Bell set out to sell the game to the masses. The only problem was that the popular space games at the time were the ones with 3 lives and missile upgrades, not the ones with hundreds of procedurally generated planets to explore.
Our first disappointment is we went to, EMI, the record company. I thought, oh, they'd be good to sell it. And EMI rejected it. And they said, oh, it hasn't got 3 lives. We want score. People want to play a game in 5 or 10 minutes. I said, no, they don't. I don't.
The person from EMI asked the pair how long it would take the player to make meaningful progress, to get the requisite power-ups and beat the game. Braben and Bell had a simple response.
I said, it doesn't matter. The aim isn't getting to the end of the game. The aim, this is a hobby. This is an environment you can live in. And they really, really hated that.
Nowadays, games are celebrated for being open-ended or hundreds of hours long. When Elite was being pitched, though, it was an outlier.
I just thought, oh my God, what if they're right? What if, Ian Bell was also, I don't want to speak for him, but that he was keen on this, something that's just very different.
The pair eventually took Elite to Acornsoft, and according to Braben, the reaction to seeing Elite was the opposite of what they got at EMI.
Couldn't have been more different, because they were techie, gamey people like us who were going, wow, how did you do that?
Acorn signed up Elite and released it on September 20th, 1984, and it went on to sell 1 million copies across multiple platforms. Back when video games were still an emerging hobby, if you had any kind of game console, chances are Elite was on it.
I think it was it something like 17 platforms that we put the original Elite on? And I think we got a little bit sick of just doing it again and again. So each version typically had a few extra features.
The different specs of each platform meant Elite was slightly different and occasionally expanded with each new release. And among those enhancements is an appropriate musical nod to the film 2001: A Space Odyssey.
We went on to machines like the Commodore 64, which had an unbelievably large memory at 64K. So we added the music, we added various other things, there were some extra missions, but the music was indeed, what you play. Obviously, it has to be Blue Danube when you dock.
Elite went on to generate numerous sequels, including Frontier Elite 2, which included even more planets with advanced physics and realistic chemistry. It also caused an influx of space games that demonstrated a desire to do more than fly and shoot. 1988's Captain Blood swapped procedurally generated galaxies for fractal landscapes, but it's clear to see how Elite helped shape its worlds. Similarly, Starlancer and its follow-up Freelancer, which was released in March 2003, were both space trading and combat games. The genre Elite kickstarted almost 2 decades earlier, but one that continues to this day. However, 1995 was almost the end for Elite. The third game in the series, Frontier First Encounters, was released in an unfinished state due to pressures applied by the game's publisher GameTech, and its reception was understandably mixed.
I even offered all the money back to show how bad it was. It was very upsetting for me because there was a good game in there.
Shortly after, Braben decided to take a break from the series. His experience with First Encounters had proved too much, but before long his passion for outer space had reignited, and following a successful Kickstarter campaign in 2012, he was able to reacquire the rights to Elite, and work began on the biggest game in the series, Elite Dangerous. By the time Elite Dangerous had emerged, the landscape of space games had changed. Narrative-driven RPGs like Mass Effect and shooters such as Halo were the biggest sci-fi games around. Though that didn't matter too much to Braben and Frontier during the development of Elite Dangerous.
And I think when you look at games like Mass Effect, which is a great game, we are different. We are doing something different. And with Starfield, I can't help but think it's going to be more Mass Effect than Elite Dangerous because of its nature. I think Starfield will be good, and I think the budget spent on it is absolutely humongous. But I'm sure it will be a good game.
The truth is, Starfield and Wing Commander and No Man's Sky and countless other space games likely wouldn't have existed if it weren't for Elite. It was the first game that took us to another galaxy from the comfort of our bedrooms, and is unquestionably the godfather of space games.
It sounds arrogant, but I think it's true. It's certainly the first game to treat that subject matter.
In 2023, the space genre has never looked so good, but obviously the hardware that modern games run on is light years beyond the tech that Braben and Bell were working with. Despite that, to this day, Elite's primary directive remains the same: to explore and live in the Starfield. not just to shoot aliens in the sky and collect a new power-up.
In my heart of hearts, I still genuinely wanted a game where I could go anywhere. I like to think that's what we delivered. Look at all those people who've gone out exploring, and we've still got a tiny fraction of 1% of the galaxy that's been visited. And that's even after 10 years. The galaxy is big. The galaxy is the same size as the real galaxy, same number of stars.
And if you like that video, why not check out a real space engineer reacting to the spaceships in Starfield? And for everything else out of space in video games, stick with IGN.